what I have seen is the implementation or the transformation that mSCOA brings about into local government has often been understated, or has often been undermined in a way, in a sense of understanding the true value or bigger picture of what is required to be achieved. And I'll put it in these terms. For instance, we come in perhaps, where clients, are struggling to get, the greens. And when the greens, are not coming forth, there's an issue now of the equitable share being held back. And that becomes, the driver to say, help us to go over this hurdle so that we can get our equitable share. And that in itself, takes away the bigger picture of where the mSCOA and how mSCOA can actually become a day-to-day way of running a municipality, such that, a green becomes an automatic. And if there's an amber, it becomes a huddle around, the table to find solutions to whatever the problems that, are coming forth. And it becomes at least an improvement point. So in this case, we had to consider and look at, various ways of how do you then get the organization. And I think it's been said, ad nauseum, but this is more a point of emphasis. How do you get the entire municipality? And by the entire municipality, we're not only merely referring to just the officials. You also need to make sure that we get, the councillors, as well as, the mSCOA, as well as, the senior people within the political leadership within a municipality to be sponsors, or as well as, to be people who are going to play that oversight role to push the implementation of mSCOA, but to have sufficient understanding such that they can also be a sounding board with regards to decisions that must be taken, as well as, resolutions that must be taken, even if it's at a mSCOA or at a council level. So it is important that it is a total organizational wide implementation and understanding that it's a transformation that is not only, as has been emphasized, financial, but it's going to turn around the entire municipality. We also found that, some of the complexities that, have come forth is the fact that the focus is mainly on the financial system, because that's where the standard chart of accounts would reside. The reality is that you have municipalities that have asset management systems that, eventually must feed into the financial system, which are not often considered. So whenever there was circulars or whatever, there was tenders in terms of, mSCOA compliant, systems, it is often the focus was on the financial systems, and hoping that, this approach is going to be changing because of at least, taking into account the business processes that are driven from the different, systems. And a good example is, an asset management system. A meter reading system, with some of the municipalities resides outside of the financial system and has to just feed in the data right at the end. And often the alignment has not been worked out. So there's also an integration issue, which we have come to understand that it must also be thought of in a much wider sense, that, there are many other systems that will eventually want to feed information into the financial system, and what information eventually falls into the chart itself. So that understanding and mapping of all of the systems that would have an impact on getting the levels, as well as, all of the strings to be able to be put together properly. You need to consider that those systems must be part of the transformation, not just, from a financial system. I think I could touch a bit more in terms of, the processes, because the processes as well within a number of municipalities, including some of the metros that we do work with, there are processes which are still manual, and that is often a way, a hindrance in a way of getting quality information to come through, because there's a paper that still has to be completed, and that paper is not well digitized, to the point where that total sum of information makes it, into the system, or then there is a capturing issue, which causes, inaccuracies and data integrity issues. So I think the important thing with, if I may reflect on the processes, is to also look at, the automation of the workflows or the forms that must capture that particular information, such that whoever captures the information it can also have some kind of a validation that that information traveling across the various systems in an integrated manner until it reaches the financial system is as accurate as should be. Of course, we've debated a lot in the beginning around the technology. And I often would give an independent view, not supporting any particular system. That, the race in the beginning was always about, which system is, the mSCOA compliant, system. And in a way that, could have been misconstrued by some of, the users within the municipal space to say, oh, we ought to change our system so that we go with this particular system that is mSCOA compliant. But the important part which I'm raising here is the fact that, there ought to be a way of also allowing some of, the whether it's a hybrid or whether it's a self-developed, systems that can also integrate into the main financial systems, because the race to build an mSCOA compliant system also meant a transformation for most of the systems providers, because they've had to redesign some of their systems. And in redesigning some of their systems and building them, some also lost the essence of how that system was supporting a municipality. Then you enter into a point where you have to have now upgrades upon upgrades and different upgrades. And meanwhile, you had a functioning system that could have integrated with an external system in the temporary or in the roadmap. And then whilst, the system matures to be able to build, that particular system. So the race in terms of, the various, service providers was always to build the best system. And I think those systems as well, in the race of them being built, often perhaps, missed, the essence of what, the mSCOA transformation is. But I'm glad that there's at least, settlement, or at least, stability with most of the systems providers to be able to get to a point where they can deliver on the mSCOA compliant, systems. Some of the things that, we have seen is that, if a system is not geared in the right way or has not been implemented in the right way, there will often be data dumps that must then be extracted right at the end. And you go through what we would call an extraction, transformation, and loading process to map, all of the strings, right at the end. And it doesn't often work well if you are mapping fields and strings and data right at the end. You ought to have at least built it up upstream, which is the integration aspect, which I was referring to earlier. The other aspect is around governance, and in fact, governance in this case points to when systems are being, or at least, a transformation is taking place, there ought to be ownership from the client point of view. And by client point of view, I'm referring mainly to the municipality in their various designations and departments with regards to how they would take ownership. What we've seen as well is that, the degree of ownership, if the degree of ownership is high, the success of, being able to move through the implementation right up until the last, bit where you have credible information is high. Where ownership, tends to be low. And I think, ownership here, I'm referring to what I opened with in terms of, taking the entire organization in the journey to be able to be mSCOA enabled. I will say enabled, and I'll tell you why. Because the issue of compliance, is one that, has thrown a lot of people out. Of course, it's a compliance matter, but not only a compliance matter, it's a business, imperative, and it's an enablement of a municipality. So allow me to just use mSCOA enabled, because it at least, takes us, even further without, the connotations of punitive measures. The other part which I want to then, put forward is, of course, the fact that, we now are moving into a transparent, arena, and some of the questions were being asked. And one of the questions was talking about, perhaps, from the supply chain management space, where some people may decide to split a tender into smaller bids, so that, they are under the radar, so that they don't have to advertise in a particular way. These are some of the benefits that, we've seen because you can trace, where the funding, comes from. You can trace what the service is. You can trace, all the other things. So mSCOA as well has got a benefit of being able to trace, some of the things that perhaps may be hidden, because if you're working in a manual space, you can easily be able to conceal some information or miss some information from that matter. But the biggest thing I want to put forward is that from a decision-making point of view, which is what we are grappling with, is that a well-implemented, or at least the embracing of mSCOA should then be used as a decision-making tool, as opposed to a transactional tool. Because what we also have seen, the temptation with Section 71 reports is, to compile it, send it to a higher authority, you dust your hands and you believe you are done with it. So I think for us here, what we need to be doing, and what we will focus on as perhaps, people who support, the mSCOA implementation and the adoption and so on, is to start looking at, how do you then build, a decision-making training exercise or simulation exercise of some sort, which helps, to appreciate the nuggets of data, as Silma would have put it, which lies within the rich information that sits in there. And I think the issue of data, we speak about it quite a lot, in local government, and we go and we negate the fact that, most of the data that we go and buy from bureaus actually sits within the different municipalities. What I would love to see is how we then harness the richness of this data to the point where it can then be utilized for decision making. But not only decision making, now that we are reviewing the local government white paper, how does it inform the assumptions that, perhaps, in the previous, process, were perhaps, assumptions that could have been thumbsucked or were not as accurate, as possible. So on that note, I think, the culture is of mSCOA, or building a new culture around, mSCOA, is one that, can take organizations forward. Thank you.